I'm Ben McGorm, and this is The Wild Harvest. There's a moment in hunting that most people never see, because nothing visible comes from it. No shot, no movement, no story to tell afterwards. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened at all. But internally, it can be one of the most significant moments in the entire experience. An animal appears. Distance, position, and possibility, they all line up just enough that your body starts preparing automatically. You settle in behind the rifle. Your breathing slows. Your attention narrows. You become very aware of how little separates potential from consequence. And then you don't act. Not because you can't, not because anything has gone wrong. Simply because something inside says this isn't the right moment to cross that line. Early on, I didn't understand those moments. I assumed hunting worked like an equation. Effort should produce outcome, and hesitation meant something was missing. More decisiveness, more confidence, more willingness to follow through. Walking away felt unfinished, almost like a mistake. Over time, that interpretation started to change. Some of the decisions I feel most settled about now they're ones that left nothing tangible behind. There was no photos, there was no weight in the pack. There was no clear endpoint that you can point to as proof that the day meant something. Just the quiet knowledge that I assessed the situation honestly and I chose not to act. Those decisions, they don't feel like failure anymore. They feel like judgment exercised without the pressure of reward. Because pulling the trigger isn't just an action. It's a commitment to everything that follows. Consequences that can't be recalled once they've begun. Modern life contains very few decisions that are irreversible. Most of our mistakes, they allow revision, right? You can apologize or you can adjust. You could try again tomorrow. A shot doesn't offer that option. Once it's taken, the situation moves forward whether you're ready for it or not. The animal's experience changes instantly. Your responsibilities expand instantly. The outcome may be clean or it may be complicated. But either way, the process is now unfolding before your control. That reality changes how the moment before the shot feels. And it stops being about whether you can make it work technically, and it becomes about whether you're prepared to own whatever happens next, including the parts that don't go as planned. Experience doesn't make that weight disappear. If anything, it makes it more defined. You become aware of how many variables sit outside your control. Wind that shifts unexpectedly. Angles that aren't quite what they appear through glass. Animals that move in the instant that you commit. Terrain that complicates recovery. Time, weather, distance, fatigue, all of it are a part of the equation whether you acknowledge it or not. None of those factors guarantee fully, but they remove the illusion that success is purely a matter of skill. And once that illusion fades, the decision becomes less about confidence, more about responsibility. Because the animal doesn't get to participate in your learning process. You can hunt again. It cannot. That asymmetry is easy to overlook when you're new. You focus on the mechanics of the shot and the excitement of the opportunity. it becomes harder to ignore once you've seen what happens when things don't go perfectly. Not catastrophic situations, just the ordinary complications that rarely make it into stories. Tracking longer than expected, or recoveries that take hours instead of minutes. Terrain that turns a straightforward task into something physically demanding. Situations where uncertainty lingers even after the shot. Those experiences don't necessarily discourage hunting, but they do change the emotional landscape of the decision. Opportunity stops feeling urgent, starts feeling conditional. The question shifts from, can I take this shot, to something quieter and more demanding. Am I prepared to deal with everything that might follow? Sometimes the honest answer is yes. Sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't, the most responsible action is also the least visible one. You lower the rifle. You watch the animal move away. And then you sit with the unfinished feeling that comes from leaving a possibility unresolved. Nothing dramatic happens, but something important has still occurred. Restraint in that moment isn't indecision. It's an acknowledgement that capability doesn't obligate action. And the ethical responsibility includes knowing when not to proceed. Episode 5 explored how capability is built, physically, mentally, and practically. Episode 6 is about what happens when capability meets a situation where the outcome cannot be undone. Not how to shoot, and not how to succeed, but how to decide. Because in hunting, the most consequential moment is rarely the shot itself. It's the judgment that comes immediately before it. The pressure in hunting rarely comes from the animal. Animals don't care how long you've been there. They don't know what it took for you to arrive in that spot, or how unlikely that moment feels from your side of it. They're simply moving through their day. They're responding to wind and scent and hunger and caution the same way that they always do. The pressure, that comes from everything around the moment. The alarm going off in the dark. The drive while the rest of the world is asleep. Boots wet before sunrise. Cold hands fumbling with gear that felt fine at home. Hours of walking that leave your legs heavy and your concentration dull around the edges. It accumulates quietly. Time spent away from family. Fuel. Planning. Permission. The sense that this day has been carved out of a life that is otherwise full, and that it needs to matter because it costs something to create. And I don't think any of that feels unreasonable. Of course you want something to come of it, right? Like, of course you want the effort to mean something tangible. And for a long time, I didn't question that. Wanting an outcome felt like part of taking hunting seriously. But slowly, and almost without noticing, that desire can shift. It stops being about the animal and it starts being about the day. The quiet belief that the early start should be justified, or that the miles walked should count for something. That going home empty-handed means the opportunity was wasted, rather than simply incomplete. You start looking at the animal not just as a living thing in front of you, but as a resolution to everything that came before it. And that's where judgment begins to narrow. Decisions happen slightly faster than they should. Uncertainty starts to feel like inconvenience rather than information. The internal question shifts. Not loudly, not consciously, but certainly enough to matter. Not, is this right? But, will I regret letting this go? And that's a dangerous question because it centers you instead of the animal. It turns restraint into loss rather than responsibility. And animals don't exist to validate our effort. They don't know what you invested to be there, and they don't owe you an ending. Recognizing that, and I mean like really recognizing it, not just agreeing with it intellectually, is one of the harder transitions in hunting. It means accepting that a day can be meaningful without producing anything visible. The effort does not guarantee resolution, and that sometimes the most responsible outcome is the one that feels the least satisfying in the moment. Refusing to act on that pressure doesn't feel heroic, just feels unfinished. And like I said, understanding all of that in theory is one thing. Living inside of it is something else entirely. Because theory doesn't carry the physical memory of what happens when judgment slips. The sound that shouldn't have been there. The movement that tells you immediately something isn't right. The silence that follows when the bush closes back over the mistake. Judgment doesn't develop in clean, abstract ways. It forms around experiences you would never choose to repeat, but can't forget once they've happened. Moments where the distance between intention and outcome collapses. Moments where you realize that wanting to do the right thing and actually doing it are not the same. Now, hunting delivers those lessons without warning. No sense you're crossing a threshold, just a normal situation that suddenly isn't. Some come from shots you don't take. Others come from shots you wish you hadn't. And the difference between them stays with you long after the day itself has faded. One of the clearest lessons I've ever had about restraint didn't come from a shot I didn't take. It came from one I should never have taken in the first place. It was in the Victorian high country. I was chasing sambar with a very experienced outfitter guiding the trip. Big country. Steep, wet, dense with blackberry, wattle and towering timber. It was the kind of landscape where distance lies to you and effort compounds quickly. Everything just feels heavier there. The terrain, the animals, and the consequences. We spotted a stag bedded across a gully. He was tucked into a thick wall of blackberry, and he wasn't moving. He wasn't exposed, but he was there, unmistakably there. Big, mature sambar stag, the kind of animal you don't get many chances at. Honestly, the range wasn't even extreme. It was maybe 100 metres. And for a 308, under normal circumstances, that's a pretty straightforward shot. But nothing about the situation was normal. I was on the opposite side of the gully, standing, using shooting sticks. The angle was awkward. The vegetation between us wasn't dense enough to completely block the view, but it was enough to obscure the detail. And that detail mattered because I couldn't clearly make out the features of the animal. I could see shape, mass. I could see movement when he shifted slightly. But not the kind of clean, defined sight picture you want when you're about to fire at something that size. I kept trying to refine the view, but I was adjusting my stance, I was leaning slightly, trying to find a position where the crosshair settled on something unmistakable. A shoulder line, ideally. I was looking for a crease, a point that felt certain. It never quite arrived. What did arrive was pressure. This was my first sambar. He was a big one. This was a genuine opportunity that most hunters wait years for. And underneath all the rational assessment, something else was happening. Something physical. Heart rate was climbing. Breathing was tightening. That electric surge people call buck fever. Right? Though with sambar it feels like less excitement and more like being plugged into a live current. I wanted the shot to be there so badly. Not because anyone was pushing me and not because the guide was rushing me, but because the opportunity itself felt too significant to let slip away. And I think in that state, your standards don't disappear, but they do bend. Just enough that uncertainty starts to look like possibility. Eventually, I convinced myself I had enough. Enough shape. Enough target. Enough confidence. I broke the shot. The sound that came back wasn't the dull impact of bullet on flesh. It was sharp, hard, and hollow. It was wood. The bullet had struck the tree beside him. That stag was gone instantly. Not crashing, not stumbling, just gone. One violent movement and then silence. The bush closing over him as if he'd never been there. And in that silence, the realization landed with absolute clarity. I hadn't missed because the rifle was off, and I hadn't missed because of distance. I'd missed because I fired without a clear sight picture. Because I let desire stand in for certainty. Because I hadn't worked harder to close the distance, to change the angle, or to accept that maybe the shot just simply wasn't there. Standing there, looking across that gully at the empty blackberry where a moment earlier there'd been a once-in-years animal, I felt something far heavier than disappointment. I felt remorse. That bullet didn't hit timber because the bush was thick. It hit timber because I accepted a shot that wasn't clean. And that's the kind of mistake hunting never lets you forget. One particular open country fallow hunt taught a very different lesson. There was no clutter, no steep terrain, no excuse rooted in environment, just distance and my willingness to pretend it didn't matter as much as it did. A meat doe stepped out into the open at range. Not extreme range, but far enough that precision, it mattered. Far enough that wind and drop weren't background considerations, they were central to the decision. And I knew, quietly, that I should be closer. Nothing in me felt confident. Not truly confident. I mean, the shot was technically possible, but it wasn't settled. Not the kind of shot you take and immediately know was right. But the opportunity was clean in every other way. It was an open field, I was in a stable position, there was plenty of time. So I convinced myself that preparation would compensate. I adjusted for distance. I considered wind. I rehearsed the hold. And then I took the shot. The reaction of that doe told me immediately that it wasn't right. There was no clean collapse. It wasn't a sprint. It was that staggered, uncertain movement that signals a hit too far back. She ran. By the time I reached her, it had taken far longer than it should have for the situation to end. She was still alive, and I had to finish it at close range. Standing over an animal in that state, it forces a kind of clarity you don't get from clean kills. You understand in a very immediate, visceral way that intention does not equal outcome. The wanting to be ethical is not the same as acting ethically in the moment. That doe didn't suffer because I didn't care. She suffered because I acted when I shouldn't have. And that distinction matters. It's also why serious hunters don't brush these experiences aside. They become a part of your internal calibration. The voice that says, closer next time. The hesitation that feels uncomfortable but keeps you from repeating the same mistake. Now, no one likes talking about bad shots. Not really. People will talk about misses. They'll talk about wind or gear and distance, awkward positions, things not going to plan. Those conversations are comfortable because they stay in the technical domain. They're problems that can be solved with practice, or equipment, or experience. But a true bad shot isn't a technical problem. It's an ethical one. Because what makes it bad isn't that you failed to hit where you aimed. It's that a living thing is now suffering because of a decision you made. And that suffering may continue long after you leave the field. And that possibility sits underneath every single shot, whether we acknowledge it or not. Now, preparation helps, and discipline helps, and experience helps. All of those things, they help reduce the risk, but none of them remove it completely, because hunting takes place in a real world that does not freeze for our convenience. The wind shifts, light changes, animals move unpredictably. Bodies don't always respond the way training says they should. And when something goes wrong, the ethical weight of the act becomes immediate. You are no longer thinking about hunting as an idea. You're inside the consequence of it. And most hunters recognize that feeling the moment it happens, right? Usually before they even reach the animal. Sometimes before they even move from where the shot was taken. There's a drop in the stomach and there's a tightening across your chest. A sudden quiet in the mind that's very different from calm. Your body knows before your thoughts can catch up. Because the body remembers impact, right? It's the wrong sound, the wrong movement, the absence of the collapse you were expecting. And then the practical side takes over. You move forward, you look for sign, you listen for movement, you try to read the ground as if it might offer some reassurance. But underneath all of that is something heavier than stress. It's the awareness that the outcome is no longer under your control, and that the animal may now be experiencing something you were trying to prevent in the first place. That's why bad shots stay with hunters. Not because they damage pride, not because they make you look inexperienced, but because they force you to confront the limits of your judgment in a situation where the cost of error is measured in suffering. And that confrontation is deeply uncomfortable because it cuts against the version of yourself you want to believe in. No one goes into the field intending to cause harm without necessity. Serious hunters spend a great deal of time preparing precisely to avoid that outcome. So when it happens anyway, the gap between intention and reality can feel almost disorienting. You did care, and you did try to do it right, but it still went wrong. That's a hard thing to carry. Honestly, it is. It's also why these experiences are rarely spoken about casually. Among all the serious hunters I know, they tend to surface only in quieter conversations, right? When trust is already established and there's no need to perform competence. Because what's being shared isn't a story of failure. It's a memory of consequence. And it's not a story you tell for effect either. It's something that resurfaces uninvited whenever a situation starts to resemble the one that created it. There's another layer as well, one that people outside hunting don't often see. When an animal is wounded rather than killed cleanly, the hunt doesn't end. It intensifies. Everything becomes more urgent and more uncertain at the same time. Tracking is no longer about opportunity, it's about resolution. You move carefully but quickly, try not to push the animal further while knowing that delay can make recovery harder. Every sign becomes important. Every patch of disturbed ground, every drop of blood, every broken stem feels loaded with meaning. And with each meter, the same question repeats itself quietly. How bad is it? A question that carries the weight of everything you hope you didn't just set in motion. Now, sometimes you find the animal quickly. Sometimes you don't, though. Sometimes the trail fades, or doubles back, or disappears into terrain that offers no clear answers. And that uncertainty can be harder to live with than a difficult recovery because it denies closure. A wounded animal that dies slowly is bad enough. An animal that's never recovered is even worse. Not because it represents lost meat or lost success, but because it leaves the ethical equation unresolved. You don't know how long it suffered. You don't know where it ended up. You don't know whether you could have done something differently. You just know that your action set about something in motion that you cannot now complete. And that possibility, it sits deep in the moral structure of hunting. It's why experienced hunters become more conservative over time, I think, not less. Not because they lose interest, but because they gain a clearer understanding of what's actually at stake. Bad shots also reveal something uncomfortable about human psychology. They rarely happen because someone consciously decides to be reckless. More often, they happen inside a chain of reasoning that feels entirely sensible at the time. You've done the work. You've waited a long time. The animal's within range. Conditions look mostly acceptable. And you may not get another chance. None of those thoughts are absurd. That's exactly why they're dangerous. Because in the moment, they don't feel reckless. They feel reasonable. Desire doesn't usually present itself as desire. It presents itself as justification. A quiet narrowing of standards just enough that almost right begins to look a lot like right enough. And in that state, you're not resisting recklessness. You're resisting a very convincing internal argument. One that sounds calm, reasonable, and even responsible. And that is the real discipline of hunting. Not just marksmanship or fieldcraft, but the ability to govern yourself honestly enough to recognize when your motivation is shifting from responsibility towards outcome. When a bad shot happens, serious hunters don't forget it. Not performatively, not as public confession, but internally as a recalibration point. A boundary marker, I guess, that shapes future decisions in ways that no amount of theory could. You replay it, you analyze it, you carry it forward. Not as shame, but as a weight. And over time, that weight becomes part of your judgment. It's the hesitation that appears earlier next time, the instinct to move closer, to wait longer, to accept uncertainty rather than forcing resolution. And I think in that sense, consequence can teach, but only if you allow it. It doesn't redeem the suffering that occurred. Nothing does that. But it can prevent you from repeating the same mistake. And in hunting, prevention matters more than redemption. For me, this is where restraint stopped being an abstract principle and became something physical. Not fear of shooting, and certainly not lack of confidence, but a refusal to act without a level of certainty that I was prepared to defend afterwards. Because once you've seen what a compromised decision can cost, the question changes. It stops being, can I make this shot? And it becomes, am I willing to own everything that might follow? And that's a much harder standard. And it should be. Hunting's not ethically serious because we say it is. It's ethically serious because suffering is real. Consequence is real. And honestly about both is the only thing that prevents the practice from drifting into self-deception. Mistakes happen, man, they always will. But the difference between a serious hunter and a careless one isn't perfection. It's whether those mistakes are felt deeply enough to change behavior. They should leave an imprint. I think not forever, and not as guilt, but as memory. The kind that appears early enough next time to stop your finger before it commits. A reminder that the animal always pays more dearly than you do for any lapse in judgment. And if that awareness fades too far into the background, something's gone wrong long before the trigger was ever touched. Now, there's also the opposite kind of lesson. There's a fellow buck that I've been tracking for nearly 3 years. Not obsessively chasing, I'm aware of him. Sign that appeared and disappeared. He's a presence on the landscape more than a target. Now, That fellow buck I've been aware of for years didn't just change how I thought about restraint, it changed how I understood presence. I'd set up mid-afternoon. It was hours before anything usually happened. And there's no guarantee it'd even appear. There's no urgency, just a quiet decision to occupy the space long enough for something natural to unfold. When the deer did come through, 25 minutes before last light, there was no sudden drama. Just the slow materialization of movement into form. Two does feeding, and a fawn circling. Then, the buck stepping out behind them. Now, everything about that opportunity was workable. Not perfect, but well inside ethical range. My rifle was steady, light was still usable, wind was predictable enough, and I was shooting across a small gully so the backstop was there. But as the minutes passed, the atmosphere kind of shifted from anticipation to observation. I started noticing details that don't register when you're locked onto a shot. Like how the fawn stayed within a certain radius, or how the does fed with complete confidence, how the buck positioned himself slightly uphill, scanning intermittently. He wasn't tense, he was just there. This wasn't a moment frozen for my benefit. It was a functioning unit moving through its environment exactly as it should. And the longer I watched it, the less desire I felt to interrupt it. Not out of sentimentality, not because I forgot the reality of hunting, but because something about the completeness of that moment made a shot feel intrusive rather than appropriate. I recognised that moment as a father myself. This was a family unit feeding in its natural environment. It was a recognition of role more than species. A recognition that not every complete moment needs to be interrupted simply because you have the ability to do so. Eventually, they drifted back into cover, leaving the space exactly as they'd found it. Walking out that evening, I realised I hadn't lost anything. I'd gained something harder to describe. A sense that hunting, at its best, is not about forcing an outcome, but about recognising when the moment itself is enough. Early seasons are driven by hunger. For proof, for experience, for the feeling of having crossed from observer to participant. Every outing feels like it should resolve into something. And over time that changes. Not because success stops mattering, but because presence starts mattering more. You learn that leaving empty-handed, it doesn't mean the day failed. It means that the conditions didn't align. Success becomes something behavioural rather than transactional. Not what you bring home, but how you conducted yourself. Most experienced hunters understand that restraint isn't an abstract virtue. It isn't something you admire from a distance or talk about in theory. It's a survival trait. Not just for the animal, but for your own conscience. Because sooner or later, every hunter learns that you don't live with the animals you take nearly as long as you live with the decisions that led to taking them. And those decisions don't fade. They don't stay in the field. They follow you home, into quiet rooms, into memory, into the way you think about yourself when no one else is around to reinforce the story. The public image of hunting rarely shows that side. What people see, even many hunters, are decisive moments, clean shots, strong animals, clear outcomes. A narrative that begins with effort and ends with success. But that's a tiny fraction of the real experience. The reality is long stretches of uncertainty punctuated by decisions that carry disproportionate weight. Hours, days, sometimes years of preparation collapsing into a few seconds where everything depends on judgment that no one else can verify. Most of those seconds end with nothing happening. Not because nothing was there, but because the conditions weren't right, because something felt off, because patience held. Experienced hunters know this, even if they don't talk about it much. They know that confidence in hunting doesn't look like eagerness, it doesn't look like intensity, it often looks like patience bordering on indifference. The willingness to let opportunities pass because not every opportunity deserves to be taken. Now, that kind of patience can be misread by people who haven't spent time in the field. It can look like hesitation, it can look like uncertainty, or like a lack of drive even. But it isn't. It's calibration. It's the ability to recognize that a moment being possible isn't the same as it being right. Now, there's an unspoken understanding amongst serious hunters that the best decisions are often invisible. They don't produce photos, they don't produce weight in your backpack, they don't produce stories unless someone else asks very specific questions. And most people don't ask those questions. Because stories without outcomes don't sound like stories at all. They sound like anticlimax, like nothing happened. But internally, those moments accumulate into something far more important than proof. They accumulate into self-trust. Self-trust isn't built by pulling the trigger. It's built by knowing you can choose not to, even when every part of you wants the opposite. Even when the conditions are tempting. Even when the opportunity feels rare enough that passing it hurts. Like my missed high country sambar shot. I wanted that shot so badly. Especially when you can still feel the echo of a decision that went the other way. Another thing experienced hunters know is that animals don't care about your effort. They don't care how far you traveled or how long you waited or how badly you want the outcome. And the bush doesn't keep score. It doesn't reward persistence with fairness. So if you measure success purely by results, hunting will always feel arbitrary. But if you measure success by decisions, by whether you acted in alignment with your own standards, well, something changes. The experience becomes internally stable, even when the outcomes aren't. You stop negotiating with the moment. You stop needing closure. You stop needing to make something happen just so the day feels justified. And perhaps most importantly, experienced hunters know that the restraint doesn't get easier because you become less interested in taking animals. It gets easier because you become more interested in doing it correctly than in doing it successfully. That's a subtle shift, but it changes everything. Early on, success feels like proof of competence. Later, competence starts to feel like the ability to walk away without needing proof at all. There's also a quiet humility that comes with time in the field. It's not performative humility, not the kind you talk about, just a recognition that animals live inside systems you'll never fully control. Wind shifts that weren't forecast, movement that you didn't anticipate, light changing faster than expected, terrain distorting distance, and fatigue dulling perception. All of it reminds you that certainty is fragile. Once you understand that deeply enough, forcing outcomes starts to feel less like confidence and more like gambling. Experienced hunters don't want to gamble with suffering. They don't want to gamble with wounded animals. They don't want to gamble with their own sense of responsibility. So they wait. Not because they're timid, but because they've learned what it costs when restraint fails. There's also an emotional layer that rarely gets discussed outside of very honest conversations. When you make a poor decision in hunting, you don't just regret it, you carry it. The memory doesn't soften into funny stories. It sits there, unresolved, because a living thing was involved. And that weight teaches in a way success never does. It sharpens your standards. It slows your impulses. It makes future decisions quieter, more deliberate, less driven by urgency. And over time, the hunter you become isn't shaped primarily by the animals you take. It's shaped by the moments where you choose correctly, even though it costs you something. A missed opportunity, an empty pack, a long walk in silence. Those costs feel real in the moment. But later, they register as something else entirely. Evidence that you can be trusted with responsibility when it matters. And that trust isn't something you can borrow from other hunters. It isn't something gear can give you. It isn't something practice at the range guarantees. It's built decision by decision, mostly in private, mostly unobserved, and mostly uncelebrated. That's what experienced hunters quietly know. The real measure of a hunter isn't how often they succeed. It's how they behave when success is available but uncertain. Because the field doesn't care what you intended, it only records what you actually do. And if you stay in it long enough, you realize that the decisions no one sees are the ones that shape you the most. Not the shot taken. It's the moment you could have taken it, but chose not to. Pulling the trigger isn't the end of the decision either. It's the beginning of everything that follows. In stories, the shot resolves the tension. The animal drops, the moment closes, and the narrative moves on. In real hunting, the shot creates a new set of problems. Immediate, unpredictable, and entirely yours to solve. Once the bullet leaves the barrel, there is no pause. There's no revision. There's no stepping back into the moment to choose differently. Whatever happens next now belongs to you. The animal may run uphill, burning its last energy into the ground that will punish you later. It may crash into thick cover where visibility drops to meters. It may cross a fence line, a gully, or a river, or a boundary you can't legally follow. It may head for water and disappear into reeds, blackberry, or country where tracking becomes guesswork instead of evidence. There's always uncertainty about the hit itself. Even a good shot rarely looks as clean through the scope as it does on paper. Animals move at the last instant. Light distorts, angles can be deceptive, adrenaline compresses time. What felt precise in the moment can become uncertain within seconds, especially if you've learned the hard way how different perfect can look once reality catches up. And then comes the waiting. Experienced hunters, they don't rush forward unless they have to. Not because they lack urgency, but because pushing a wounded animal too soon can turn a recoverable situation into a lost one. So you sit, you listen, and inevitably you replay the shot in your mind, trying to hold on to what actually happened before doubt starts reshaping it. That waiting carries its own pressure. The decision's already been made. Now the task is to not make things worse. And all of this assumes that the animal goes down within sight. Often it doesn't. So now you're tracking. Sometimes upright, sometimes on hands and knees, reading the ground like a language you hope you understand. Drops of blood on leaves or disturbed soil, broken stems, a faint line where something heavy passed through vegetation that's already beginning to settle back into place. Tracking collapses the hunt down to meters and minutes. There's absolutely no spectacle in it. It's just concentration and the growing awareness that the outcome is no longer guaranteed. A level of focus that leaves no room for denial about what's actually happened. And at the same time, another clock is running. Light's fading. Temperature is rising or falling, and weather may be turning. Because recovery isn't just about finding the animal, it's about what happens after you do. Terrain matters, and safety matters, whether you're alone matters. If the animal drops in the worst possible place, down a steep face or across a creek deep in dense scrub, you still have to reach it, process it, and get it back out. And that means carrying weight, managing time, managing fatigue, managing the risk of injury when you're already deep in the bush and committed to the task. These aren't theoretical outcomes, they're immediate, practical limits. Experienced hunters think about them before they shoot, not afterwards. Because taking a shot commits you to solving every problem that might result from it, not just the ones that you hope for. That reality rarely appears in stories. Stories tend to end where the real work begins. The emotional peak is brief. The work that follows can take hours, sometimes longer, and it's often quiet, repetitive labor rather than anything that feels triumphant. There have been times where I've stood behind the rifle and realized that even if the shot were perfect, the recovery wouldn't be. Not safely, not responsibly, not without risking waste or unnecessary suffering. That recognition changes the decision completely. The question is no longer just whether you can hit the animal. It becomes whether you can honor what happens next. Pulling the trigger is a promise that you'll follow through physically, morally, and practically until the animal's recovered, or until you've exhausted every possible effort to do so. And if you can't make that promise honestly, then the shot doesn't exist as an ethical option, no matter how achievable it might look. There's also a psychological weight to this phase that people outside hunting rarely see. Because after the shot, there is no audience. There's no validation, no one to share the responsibility with. If the recovery is difficult, you solve it. If something goes wrong, you carry it. If doubt creeps in, there is no guarantee of resolution. And that solitude sharpens everything. It strips away ego and performance, and what remains is competence, preparation, and character. Nothing else. And often, that's where the real measure of the hunt begins. Success isn't just the kill, it's the recovery and the respect shown to the animal. The refusal to abandon the work when it stops becoming exciting and becomes difficult, messy, or exhausting. Experienced hunters know this, even if they rarely talk about it. The shot itself is only a small part of the process. Everything after the shot reveals who you actually are in the field. Not who you intended to be, but who you actually are when responsibility becomes unavoidable. And once you've lived through that, dragging an animal uphill in failing light, processing it alone in bad weather, tracking for hours with no certainty of finding it, your relationship to the trigger changes. Opportunities stop looking simple. Distances feel longer and angles carry more weight. Because you're no longer thinking about only the moment of impact. You're thinking about the entire chain of responsibility that follows. Sometimes the most ethical decision isn't whether the bullet will land where it intended. It's whether you can responsibly handle everything that happens afterwards. And that is a far more demanding question. If there's a single lesson that's taken the longest to settle, it's that success in hunting doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, not a lack of desire. Restraint grounded in clarity. Clarity that's been shaped as much by mistakes as by successes. Clarity about what you're responsible for. Clarity about what you can control and what you can't. Clarity about the fact that the animal in front of you is not there to resolve anything for you. Not your effort, not your expectations, and not your need for an outcome. Early on, success felt simple. See the animal, take the shot, bring something home. A clean, understandable narrative that matched the effort invested. Over time, that definition became harder to maintain. Some of the decisions I'm most comfortable with now are the ones that produce nothing visible at all. Days that ended the same way they began, except for a quiet sense that I hadn't forced something that shouldn't have been forced. No evidence, no proof, no story that sounds impressive when told later. Just the quiet absence of the kind of memory I'd rather not carry. That's not a satisfying metric if you're looking for validation. It doesn't translate into photos or numbers or external markers of achievement. But internally, it's unmistakable. It's a calm that sits underneath the memory rather than agitation that needs to be explained away. Every hunt shapes judgment a little further, sometimes by what you take and sometimes by what you choose not to repeat. Not just through success, but through restraint. Through the accumulation of moments where you choose responsibility over resolution, even when no one else will ever know the difference. Because hunting, at its core, is not performative. It's a relationship with consequence. And the only person who ultimately has to live with your decisions is you. When the moment truly is right, action doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like seizing an opportunity before it disappears. It feels almost anticlimactic. It's a quiet continuation of everything that led to it. Because you've learned how wrong feels. And when that moment isn't right, walking away doesn't feel like failure at all. It feels complete. That's when you know judgment started to take root. Not because you always get it perfect, but because you no longer need an outcome to feel that the day mattered. You can simply leave things as they are. For me, that's what success looks like now. Not the shot itself, but the ability to decide. Honestly, calmly, and without pressure, whether taking it is something I'm prepared to carry afterwards. And if the answer is yes, I act. If it isn't, I don't. And either way, the responsibility stays with me. I'm Ben McGorm, and this is The Wild Harvest.